Imagine a world where a long-lost treasure hides a deadly secret. A romantic getaway turns into a terrifying nightmare, and a seemingly innocent accident spirals into a web of deceit. In this video, we're bringing you 3 of Agatha Christie's most mind-bending tales. First, we dive into The Apples of the Hesperides, where an ancient treasure and a dark family secret collide in a way that will have you questioning everything. Then, in Philomel Cottage, a young bride discovers that her dream life might just be the perfect setup for a chilling crime. And finally, in Accident, a simple car crash becomes a twisted game of fate and revenge. These aren't just your average mysteries. They're wild rides filled with shocking turns, deadly lies, and endings that will leave you stunned. Ready to see how it all unfolds? Let's dive in.
Dear friends, now you will hear an intriguing detective story by Agatha Christie, The Apples of the Hesperides. Thank you for choosing this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Enjoy listening. The Apples of the Hesperides is part of Agatha Christie's The Labours of Hercules collection, with each story drawing inspiration from one of the classical labours of Hercules. In this story, Christie parallels the myth of the Apples of the Hesperides, where Hercules is tasked with retrieving the golden apples guarded by a fearsome dragon. Poirot's quest to recover the stolen goblet mirrors this labour, as he navigates through complex obstacles and dangerous characters to retrieve a long-lost treasure. The story reflects Christie's talent for blending classical mythology with modern detective fiction, adding depth and symbolism to the narrative. Hercule Poirot looked thoughtfully into the face of the man behind the big mahogany desk. He noted the generous brow, the mean mouth, the rapacious line of the jaw, and the piercing, visionary eyes. He understood from looking at the man why Emery Power had become the great financial force that he was. And his eyes falling to the long, delicate hands, exquisitely shaped, that lay on the desk, he understood, too, why Emery Power had attained renown as a great collector. He was known on both sides of the Atlantic as a connoisseur of works of art. His passion for the artistic went hand in hand with an equal passion for the historic. It was not enough for him that a thing should be beautiful. He demanded also that it should have a tradition behind it. Emery Power was speaking. His voice was quiet, a small, distinct voice that was more effective than any mere volume of sound could have been. You do not, I know, take many cases nowadays, but I think you will take this one. Is it then an affair of great moment? Emery Power said, It is of moment to me. Poirot remained in an inquiring attitude, his head slightly on one side. He looked like a meditative robin. The other went on, It concerns the recovery of a work of art. To be exact, a gold-chased goblet, dating from the Renaissance. It is said to be the goblet used by Pope Alexander VI, Roderigo Borgia. He sometimes presented it to a favoured guest to drink from. That guest, Monsieur Poirot, usually died. A pretty history, Poirot murmured. Its career has always been associated with violence. It has been stolen more than once. Murder has been done to gain possession of it. A trail of bloodshed has followed it through the ages. On account of its intrinsic value, or for other reasons? Its intrinsic value is certainly considerable. The workmanship is exquisite. It is said to have been made by Benvenuto Cellini. The design represents a tree round which a jewelled serpent is coiled, and the apples on the tree are formed of very beautiful emeralds. Poirot murmured with an apparent quickening of interest. Apples? The emeralds are particularly fine, so are the rubies in the serpent, but of course the real value of the cup is its historical associations. It was put up for sale by the Marchese di San Verratrino in 1929. Collectors bid against each other, and I secured it finally for a sum equalling, at the then rate of exchange, £30,000. Poirot raised his eyebrows. He murmured, Indeed, a princely sum. The Marchese di San Verratrino was fortunate. Emery Power said, When I really want a thing, I am willing to pay for it, Monsieur Poirot. Hercule Poirot said softly. "You have no doubt heard the Spanish proverb, 'Take what you want, and pay for it,' says God." For a moment the financier frowned. A swift light of anger showed in his eyes. He said coldly, "You are by way of being a philosopher, Monsieur Poirot." "I have arrived at the age of reflection, monsieur." "Doubtless. But it is not reflection that will restore my goblet to me." "You think not? I fancy action will be necessary." Hercule Poirot nodded placidly. "A lot of people make the same mistake. But I demand your pardon, Mr. Power. We have digressed from the matter in hand. You were saying that you had bought the cup from the Marchese di San Veretrino?" "Exactly. What I have now to tell you is that it was stolen before it actually came into my possession." "How did that happen?" "The Marchese's palace was broken into on the night of the sale, and 8 or 10 pieces of considerable value were stolen, including the goblet." "What was done in the matter?" Power shrugged his shoulders. "The police, of course, took the matter in hand. The robbery was recognized to be the work of a well-known international gang of thieves. 2 of their number, a Frenchman called Doublet and an Italian called Ricovetti, were caught and tried. Some of the stolen goods were found in their possession." "But not the Borgia goblet?" "But not the Borgia goblet. There were, as far as the police could ascertain, 3 men actually engaged in the robbery. The 2 I have just mentioned, and a third, an Irishman named Patrick Casey. This last was an expert cat burglar. It was he who is said to have actually stolen the things. Doublet was the brains of the group and planned their coups. Ricovetti drove the car and waited below for the goods to be lowered down to him. And the stolen goods? Were they split up into 3 parts? Possibly. On the other hand, the articles that were recovered were those of least value. It seems possible that the more noteworthy and spectacular pieces had been hastily smuggled out of the country." "What about the third man, Casey? Was he never brought to justice?" "Not in the sense you mean. He was not a very young man. His muscles were stiffer than formerly. 2 weeks later he fell from the 5th floor of a building and was killed instantly." "Where was this?" "In Paris. He was attempting to rob the house of the millionaire banker, Duvauglier." "And the goblet has never been seen since?" "Exactly." "It has never been offered for sale?" "I am quite sure it has not. I may say that not only the police, but also private inquiry agents, have been on the lookout for it." "What about the money you had paid over?" "The Marchese, a very punctilious person, offered to refund it to me, as the cup had been stolen from his house." "But you did not accept?" "No." "Why was that?" "Shall we say because I preferred to keep the matter in my own hands?" "You mean that if you had accepted the Marchese's offer, the goblet, if recovered, would be his property, whereas now it is legally yours?" "Exactly." Poirot asked, "What was there behind that attitude of yours?" Emery Power said with a smile, "You appreciate that point, I see. Well, Monsieur Poirot, it is quite simple. I thought I knew who was actually in possession of the goblet." "Very interesting. And who was it?" "Sir Reuben Rosenthal. He was not only a fellow collector, but he was at the time a personal enemy. We had been rivals in several business deals, and on the whole I had come out the better. Our animosity culminated in this rivalry over the Borgia goblet. Each of us was determined to possess it. It was more or less a point of honor. Our appointed representatives bid against each other at the sale." "And your representative's final bid secured the treasure?" "Not precisely. I took the precaution of having a second agent, ostensibly the representative of a Paris dealer. Neither of us, you understand, would have been willing to yield to the other, but to allow a third party to acquire the cup, with the possibility of approaching that third party quietly afterwards. That was a very different matter. In fact, une petite déception." "Exactly." "Which was successful, and immediately afterwards Sir Reuben discovered how he had been tricked." Power smiled. It was a revealing smile. Poirot said, "I see the position now. You believe that Sir Reuben, determined not to be beaten, deliberately commissioned the theft." Emery Power raised a hand. "Oh, no, no. It would not be so crude as that. It amounted to this. Shortly afterwards, Sir Reuben would have purchased a Renaissance goblet, provenance unspecified. The description of which would have been circulated by the police? The goblet would not have been placed openly on view. You think it would have been sufficient for Sir Reuben to know that he possessed it? Yes. Moreover, if I had accepted the Marchese's offer, it would have been possible for Sir Reuben to conclude a private arrangement with him later, thus allowing the goblet to pass legally into his possession. He paused a minute and then said, "But by retaining the legal ownership, there were still possibilities left open to me of recovering my property." "You mean," said Poirot bluntly, "that you could arrange for it to be stolen from Sir Reuben?" "Not stolen, Monsieur Poirot. I should have been merely recovering my own property." "But I gather that you were not successful?" "For a very good reason. Rosenthal has never had the goblet in his possession." "How do you know?" "Recently there has been a merger of oil interests. Rosenthal's interests and mine now coincide. We are allies and not enemies. I spoke to him frankly on the subject, and he at once assured me that the cup had never been in his possession." "And you believe him?" "Yes." Poirot said thoughtfully, "Then for nearly 10 years you have been, as they say in this country, barking up the mistaken tree?" The financier said bitterly, "Yes, that is exactly what I have been doing." "And now it is all to start again from the beginning?" The other nodded. "And that is where I come in? I am the dog that you set upon the cold scent, a very cold scent." Emery Power said dryly, "If the affair were easy, it would not have been necessary for me to send for you. Of course, if you think it impossible." He had found the right word. Hercule Poirot drew himself up. He said coldly, "I do not recognize the word impossible, monsieur. I ask myself only, is this affair sufficiently interesting for me to undertake?" Emery Power smiled again. He said, "It has this interest. You may name your own fee." The small man looked at the big man. He said softly, "Do you then desire this work of art so much? Surely not." Emery Power said, "Put it that I, like yourself, do not accept defeat." Hercule Poirot bowed his head. He said, "Yes, put that way. I understand." Inspector Wagstaff was interested. "The Veretrino cup? Yes, I remember all about it. I was in charge of the business this end. I speak a bit of Italiano, you know, and I went over and had a powwow with the macaronis. It's never turned up from that day to this. Funny thing, that." "What is your explanation? A private sale?" Wagstaff shook his head. "I doubt it. Of course it's remotely possible. No, my explanation is a good deal simpler. The stuff was cached, and the only man who knew where it was is dead." "You mean Casey?" "Yes. He may have cached it somewhere in Italy, or he may have succeeded in smuggling it out of the country. But he hid it, and wherever he hid it, there it still is." Hercule Poirot sighed. "It is a romantic theory. Pearls stuffed into plaster casts. What is the story? The bust of Napoleon, is it not? But in this case, it is not jewels. It is a large, solid gold cup. Not so easy to hide that, one would think." Wagstaff said vaguely, "Oh, I don't know. It could be done, I suppose. Under the floorboards, something of that kind." "Had Casey a house of his own?" "Yes, in Liverpool." He grinned. "It wasn't under the floorboards there. We made sure of that." "What about his family?" "Wife was a decent sort of woman. Tubercular. Worried to death by her husband's way of life. She was religious. A devout Catholic, but couldn't make up her mind to leave him. She died a couple of years ago. Daughter took after her. She became a nun. The son was different. A chip off the old block. Last I heard of him, he was doing time in America." Hercule Poirot wrote in his little notebook, "America." He said, "It is possible that Casey's son may have known the hiding place." "Don't believe he did. It would have come into the fence's hands by now. The cup might have been melted down." "It might. Quite possible, I should say. But I don't know. Its supreme value is to collectors, and there's a lot of funny business goes on with collectors. You'd be surprised." "Sometimes," said Wagstaff virtuously, "I think collectors haven't any morals at all." "Ah, would you be surprised if Sir Reuben Rosenthal, for instance, were engaged in what you describe as funny business?" Wagstaff grinned. "I wouldn't put it past him. He's not supposed to be very scrupulous where works of art are concerned." "What about the other members of the gang?" "Ricovetti and Dublé both got stiff sentences. I should imagine they'll be coming out about now." "Dublé is a Frenchman, is he not?" "Yes, he was the brains of the gang." "Were there other members of it?" "There was a girl, Red Kate she used to be called. Took a job as lady's maid and found out all about a crib, where stuff was kept and so on. She went to Australia, I believe, after the gang broke up." "Anyone else?" "Chap called Uguyen was suspected of being in with them. He's a dealer. Headquarters in Stamboul, but he has a shop in Paris. Nothing proved against him, but he's a slippery customer." Poirot sighed. He looked at his little notebook. In it was written, "America, Australia, Italy, France, Turkey." He murmured, "I'll put a girdle round the earth." "Pardon?" said Inspector Wagstaff. "I was observing," said Hercule Poirot, "that a world tour seems indicated." It was the habit of Hercule Poirot to discuss his cases with his capable valet, Georges. That is to say, Hercule Poirot would let drop certain observations to which George would reply with the worldly wisdom which he had acquired in the course of his career as a gentleman's gentleman. "If you were faced, Georges," said Poirot, "with the necessity of conducting investigations in 5 different parts of the globe, how would you set about it?" "Well, sir, air travel is very quick, though some say as it upsets the stomach. I couldn't say myself." "One asks oneself," said Hercule Poirot. "What would Hercules have done?" "You mean the bicycle chap, sir?" "Or," pursued Hercule Poirot, "one simply asks, what did he do? And the answer, Georges, is that he travelled energetically, but he was forced in the end to obtain information, as some say, from Prometheus, others from Nereus." "Indeed, sir," said George. "I never heard of either of those gentlemen. Are they travel agencies, sir?" Hercule Poirot, enjoying the sound of his own voice, went on, "My client, Emery Power, understands only one thing, action, but it is useless to dispense energy by unnecessary action. There is a golden rule in life, Georges. Never do anything yourself that others can do for you." "Especially," added Hercule Poirot, rising and going to the bookshelf, "when expense is no object." He took from the shelf a file labelled with the letter D and opened it at the words, "Detective Agencies Reliable." "The modern Prometheus," he murmured. "Be so obliging, Georges, as to copy out for me certain names and addresses. Messrs. Hankerton, New York; Messrs. Leyden and Boscher, Sydney; Signor Giovanni Mezzi, Rome; Monsieur Nahum, Stamboul; Messrs. Roger et Franconard, Paris." He paused while George finished this. Then he said, "And now be so kind as to look up the trains for Liverpool." "Yes, sir. You are going to Liverpool, sir?" "I am afraid so. It is possible, Georges, that I may have to go even further, but not just yet." It was 3 months later that Hercule Poirot stood on a rocky point and surveyed the Atlantic Ocean. Gulls rose and swooped down again with long, melancholy cries. The air was soft and damp. Hercule Poirot had the feeling, not uncommon in those who come to Inishgowlan for the first time, that he had reached the end of the world. He had never in his life imagined anything so remote, so desolate, so abandoned. It had beauty, a melancholy, haunted beauty, the beauty of a remote and incredible past. Here, in the west of Ireland, the Romans had never marched, tramp, 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 had never fortified a camp, had never built a well-ordered, sensible, useful road. It was a land where common sense and an orderly way of life were unknown. Hercule Poirot looked down at the tips of his patent leather shoes and sighed. He felt forlorn and very much alone. The standards by which he lived were here not appreciated. His eyes swept slowly up and down the desolate coastline, then once more out to sea. Somewhere out there, so tradition had it, were the Isles of the Blessed, the land of youth. He murmured to himself, the apple tree, the singing and the gold. And suddenly Hercule Poirot was himself again. The spell was broken. He was once more in harmony with his patent leather shoes and natty dark grey gents suiting. Not very far away he had heard the toll of a bell. He understood that bell. It was a sound he had been familiar with from early youth. He set off briskly along the cliff. In about 10 minutes he came in sight of the building on the cliff. A high wall surrounded it, and a great wooden door studded with nails was set in the wall. Hercule Poirot came to this door and knocked. There was a vast iron knocker. Then he cautiously pulled at a rusty chain, and a shrill little bell tinkled briskly inside the door. A small panel in the door was pushed aside and showed a face. It was a suspicious face, framed in starched white. There was a distinct moustache on the upper lip, but the voice was the voice of a woman. It was the voice of what Hercule Poirot called a femme formidable. It demanded his business. "Is this the convent of St. Mary and All Angels?" The formidable woman said with asperity, "And what else would it be?" Hercule Poirot did not attempt to answer that. He said to the dragon, "I would like to see the Mother Superior." The dragon was unwilling, but in the end she yielded. Bars were drawn back, the door opened, and Hercule Poirot was conducted to a small bare room where visitors to the convent were received. Presently a nun glided in, her rosary swinging at her waist. Hercule Poirot was a Catholic by birth. He understood the atmosphere in which he found himself. "I apologize for troubling you, ma mère," he said, "but you have here, I think, a religieuse who was, in the world, Kate Casey." The Mother Superior bowed her head. She said, "That is so, Sister Mary Ursula in religion." Hercule Poirot said, "There is a certain wrong that needs righting. I believe that Sister Mary Ursula could help me. She has information that might be invaluable." The Mother Superior shook her head. Her face was placid, her voice calm and remote. She said, "Sister Mary Ursula cannot help you." "But I assure you—" He broke off. The Mother Superior said, "Sister Mary Ursula died 2 months ago." In the saloon bar of Jimmy Donovan's hotel, Hercule Poirot sat uncomfortably against the wall. The hotel did not come up to his ideas of what a hotel should be. His bed was broken, so were 2 of the window panes in his room, thereby admitting that night air which Hercule Poirot distrusted so much. The hot water brought him had been tepid, and the meal he had eaten was producing curious and painful sensations in his inside. There were 5 men in the bar, and they were all talking politics. For the most part, Hercule Poirot could not understand what they said. In any case, he did not much care. Presently he found one of the men sitting beside him. This was a man of slightly different class to the others. He had the stamp of the seedy townsman upon him. He said with immense dignity, "I tell you, sir, I tell you, Pagan's pride hasn't got a chance, not a chance. Bound to finish right down the course. Right down the course. You take my tip. Everybody ought to take my tip. Know who I am, sir? Do you know, I Shay? Atlas. That's who I am. Atlas of the Dublin Sun. Been tipping Winnersh all the season. Didn't I give Larry's girl? 25 to 1, 25 to 1. Follow Atlas, and you can't go wrong." Hercule Poirot regarded him with a strange reverence. He said, and his voice trembled, "Mon Dieu, it is an omen." It was some hours later. The moon showed from time to time, peeping out coquettishly from behind the clouds. Poirot and his new friend had walked some miles. The former was limping. The idea crossed his mind that there were, after all, other shoes, more suitable to country walking than patent leather. Actually, George had respectfully conveyed as much. "A nice pair of brogues," was what George had said. Hercule Poirot had not cared for the idea. He liked his feet to look neat and well shod. But now, tramping along this stony path, he realized that there were other shoes. His companion said suddenly, "Is it the way the priest would be after me for this? I'll not have a mortal sin upon my conscience." Hercule Poirot said, "You are only restoring to Caesar the things which are Caesar's." They had come to the wall of the convent. Atlas prepared to do his part. A groan burst from him, and he exclaimed in low, poignant tones that he was destroyed entirely. Hercule Poirot spoke with authority. "Be quiet. It is not the weight of the world that you have to support, only the weight of Hercule Poirot." Atlas was turning over 2 new 5-pound notes. He said hopefully, "Maybe I'll not remember in the morning the way I earned this. I'm after worrying that Father O'Reilly will be after me." "Forget everything, my friend. Tomorrow the world is yours." Atlas murmured, "And what'll I put it on? There's Working Lad. He's a grand horse, a lovely horse he is. And there's Sheila Boyne. To one I'd get on her." He paused. "Was it my fancy now, or did I hear you mention the name of a heathen god? Hercules, you said, and glory be to God, there's a Hercules running in the 3:30 tomorrow." "My friend," said Hercule Poirot, "put your money on that horse. I tell you this, Hercules cannot fail." And it is certainly true that on the following day Mr. Roslin's Hercules very unexpectedly won the Boynan Stakes, starting price 60 to 1. Deftly, Hercule Poirot unwrapped the neatly done-up parcel. First the brown paper, then the wadding, lastly the tissue paper. On the desk in front of Emery Power he placed a gleaming golden cup. Chased on it was a tree bearing apples of green emeralds. The financier drew a deep breath. He said, "I congratulate you, Monsieur Poirot." Hercule Poirot bowed. Emery Power stretched out a hand. He touched the rim of the goblet, drawing his finger round it. He said in a deep voice, "Mine!" Hercule Poirot agreed. "Yours." The other gave a sigh. He leaned back in his chair. He said in a businesslike voice, "Where did you find it?" Hercule Poirot said, "I found it on an altar." Emery Power stared. Poirot went on. "Casey's daughter was a nun. She was about to take her final vows at the time of her father's death. She was an ignorant but a devout girl. The cup was hidden in her father's house in Liverpool. She took it to the convent, wanting, I think, to atone for her father's sins. She gave it to be used to the glory of God. I do not think that the nuns themselves ever realized its value. They took it, probably, for a family heirloom. In their eyes it was a chalice, and they used it as such." Emery Power said, "An extraordinary story," he added. "What made you think of going there?" Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "Perhaps a process of elimination. And then there was the extraordinary fact that no one had ever tried to dispose of the cup. That looked, you see, as though it were in a place where ordinary material values did not apply. I remembered that Patrick Casey's daughter was a nun." Power said heartily, "Well, as I said before, I congratulate you. Let me know your fee, and I'll write you a cheque." Hercule Poirot said, "There is no fee." The other stared at him. "What do you mean?" "Did you ever read fairy stories when you were a child? The king in them would say, 'Ask of me what you will.' So you are asking something?" "Yes, but not money, merely a simple request." "Well, what is it? Do you want a tip for the markets?" "That would be only money in another form. My request is much simpler than that." "What is it?" Hercule Poirot laid his hands on the cup. "Send this back to the convent." There was a pause. Then Emery Power said, "Are you quite mad?" Hercule Poirot shook his head. "No, I am not mad. See, I will show you something." He picked up the goblet. With his fingernail, he pressed hard into the open jaws of the snake that was coiled round the tree. Inside the cup, a tiny portion of the gold-chased interior slid aside, leaving an aperture into the hollow handle. Poirot said, "You see, this was the drinking cup of the Borgia Pope. Through this little hole the poison passed into the drink. You have said yourself that the history of this cup is evil. Violence and blood and evil passions have accompanied its possession. Evil will perhaps come to you in turn. Superstition? Possibly. But why were you so anxious to possess this thing? Not for its beauty, not for its value. You have 100, 1,000, perhaps, beautiful and rare things. You wanted it to sustain your pride. You were determined not to be beaten. Eh bien, you are not beaten. You win. The goblet is in your possession. But now, why not make a supreme gesture? Send it back to where it has dwelt in peace for nearly 10 years. Let the evil of it be purified there. It belonged to the church once. Let it return to the church. Let it stand once more on the altar, purified and absolved, as we hope that the souls of men shall be also purified and absolved from their sins. He leaned forward. Let me describe for you the place where I found it. The Garden of Peace, looking out over the western sea towards a forgotten paradise of youth and eternal beauty. He spoke on, describing in simple words the remoter charm of Inishgolan. Emery Power sat back, one hand over his eyes. He said at last, I was born on the west coast of Ireland. I left there as a boy to go to America. Poirot said gently, I heard that. The financier sat up. His eyes were shrewd again. He said, and there was a faint smile on his lips, You are a strange man, Monsieur Poirot. You shall have your way. Take the goblet to the convent as a gift in my name. A pretty costly gift. 30,000 pounds. And what shall I get in exchange? Poirot said gravely, The nuns will say masses for your soul. The rich man's smile widened, a rapacious, hungry smile. He said, So, after all, it may be an investment. Perhaps the best one I ever made. In the little parlour of the convent, Hercule Poirot told his story and restored the chalice to the Mother Superior. She murmured, Tell him we thank him and we will pray for him. Hercule Poirot said gently, He needs your prayers. Is he then an unhappy man? Poirot said, So unhappy that he has forgotten what happiness means. So unhappy that he does not know he is unhappy. The nun said softly, Ah, a rich man. Hercule Poirot said nothing, for he knew there was nothing to say. Agatha Christie, Accident. Accident was first published as The Uncrossed Path in the Sunday Dispatch, 22nd September 1929. And I tell you this, it's the same woman, not a doubt of it. Captain Haydock looked into the eager, vehement face of his friend and sighed. He wished Evans would not be so positive and so jubilant. In the course of a career spent at sea, the old sea captain had learned to leave things that did not concern him well alone. His friend, Evans, late CID inspector, had a different philosophy of life. Acting on information received had been his motto in early days, and he had improved upon it to the extent of finding out his own information. Inspector Evans had been a very smart, wide-awake officer and had justly earned the promotion which had been his. Even now, when he had retired from the force and had settled down in the country cottage of his dreams, his professional instinct was still active. Don't often forget a face, he reiterated complacently. Mrs. Anthony, yes, it's Mrs. Anthony right enough. When you said Mrs. Merrodine, I knew her at once. Captain Haydock stirred uneasily. The Merrodens were his nearest neighbours, barring Evans himself, and this identifying of Mrs. Merroden with a former heroine of a cause célèbre distressed him. It's a long time ago, he said rather weakly. 9 years, said Evans, accurately as ever. 9 years and 3 months. You remember the case? In a vague sort of way. Anthony turned out to be an arsenic eater, said Evans, so they acquitted her. Well, why shouldn't they? No reason in the world. Only verdict they could give on the evidence. Absolutely correct. Then that's all right, said Haydock, and I don't see what we're bothering about. Who's bothering? I thought you were. Not at all. The thing's over and done with, summed up the captain. If Mrs. Merrodin at one time of her life was unfortunate enough to be tried and acquitted for murder, it's not usually considered unfortunate to be acquitted, put in Evans. You know what I mean, said Captain Haydock irritably. If the poor lady has been through that harrowing experience, it's no business of ours to rake it up, is it? Evans did not answer. Come now, Evans. The lady was innocent. You've just said so. I didn't say she was innocent. I said she was acquitted, It's the same thing. Not always. Captain Haydock, who had commenced to tap his pipe out against the side of his chair, stopped and sat up with a very alert expression. "Hello, hello, hello," he said. "The wind's in that quarter, is it? You think she wasn't innocent?" "I wouldn't say that. I just don't know. Anthony was in the habit of taking arsenic. His wife got it for him. One day by mistake he takes far too much. Was the mistake his or his wife's? Nobody could tell, and the jury very properly gave her the benefit of the doubt. That's all quite right, and I'm not finding fault with it. All the same, I'd like to know." Captain Haydock transferred his attention to his pipe once more. "Well," he said comfortably, "it's none of our business." "I'm not so sure. But surely—" "Listen to me a minute. This man, Merodine, in his laboratory this evening, fiddling round with tests. You remember?" "Yes. He mentioned Marsh's test for arsenic. Said you would know all about it. It was in your line," and chuckled. "He wouldn't have said that if he'd thought for one moment—" Evans interrupted him. "You mean he wouldn't have said that if he knew? They've been married how long? 6 years, you told me. I bet you anything he has no idea his wife is the once notorious Mrs. Anthony." "And he will certainly not know it from me," said Captain Haydock stiffly. Evans paid no attention but went on. "You interrupted me just now. After Marsh's test, Merodine heated a substance in a test tube. The metallic residue he dissolved in water and then precipitated it by adding silver nitrate. That was a test for chlorates, a neat, unassuming little test. But I chanced to read these words in a book that stood open on the table. H2SO4 decomposes chlorates with evolution of Cl4O2. If heated, violent explosions occur. The mixture ought therefore to be kept cool, and only very small quantities used." Haydock stared at his friend. "Well, what about it?" "Just this. In my profession we've got tests too. Tests for murder. There's adding up the facts, weighing them, dissecting the residue when you've allowed for prejudice and the general inaccuracy of witnesses. But there's another test of murder, one that is fairly accurate but rather dangerous. A murderer is seldom content with one crime. Give him time and a lack of suspicion, and he'll commit another. You catch a man? Has he murdered his wife, or hasn't he? Perhaps the case isn't very black against him. Look into his past. If you find that he's had several wives, and that they've all died, shall we say, rather curiously, then you know. I'm not speaking legally, you understand. I'm speaking of moral certainty. Once you know, you can go ahead looking for evidence. Well, I'm coming to the point. That's all right if there is a past to look into. But suppose you catch your murderer at his or her first crime. Then that test will be one from which you get no reaction. But suppose the prisoner acquitted, starting life under another name. Will or will not the murderer repeat the crime? That's a horrible idea. Do you still say it's none of our business? Yes, I do. You've no reason to think that Mrs. Merodine is anything but a perfectly innocent woman. The ex-inspector was silent for a moment. Then he said slowly, I told you that we looked into her past and found nothing. That's not quite true. There was a stepfather. As a girl of 18, she had a fancy for some young man, and her stepfather exerted his authority to keep them apart. She and her stepfather went for a walk along a rather dangerous part of the cliff. There was an accident. The stepfather went too near the edge. It gave way and he went over and was killed. You don't think... It was an accident. Accident. Anthony's overdose of arsenic was an accident. She'd never have been tried if it hadn't transpired that there was another man. He sheared off, by the way. Looked as though he weren't satisfied, even if the jury were. I tell you, Haydock, where that woman is concerned, I'm afraid of another accident. The old captain shrugged his shoulders. It's been 9 years since that affair. Why should there be another accident, as you call it now? I didn't say now. I said some day or other. If the necessary motive arose. Captain Haydock shrugged his shoulders. Well, I don't know how you're going to guard against that." "Neither do I," said Evans ruefully. "I should leave well alone," said Captain Haydock. "No good ever came of butting into other people's affairs." But that advice was not palatable to the ex-inspector. He was a man of patience, but determination. Taking leave of his friend, he sauntered down to the village, revolving in his mind the possibilities of some kind of successful action. Turning into the post office to buy some stamps, he ran into the object of his solicitude, George Merrodane. The ex-chemistry professor was a small, dreamy-looking man, gentle and kindly in manner, and usually completely absent-minded. He recognized the other and greeted him amicably, stooping to recover the letters that the impact had caused him to drop on the ground. Evans stooped also, and, more rapid in his movements than the other, secured them first, handing them back to their owner with an apology. He glanced down at them in doing so, and the address on the topmost suddenly awakened all his suspicions anew. It bore the name of a well-known insurance firm. Instantly his mind was made up. The guileless George Merrodane hardly realized how it came about that he and the ex-inspector were strolling down the village together, and still less could he have said how it came about that the conversation should come round to the subject of life insurance. Evans had no difficulty in attaining his object. Merrodane of his own accord volunteered the information that he had just insured his life for his wife's benefit, and asked Evans's opinion of the company in question. "I made some rather unwise investments," he explained. "As a result, my income has diminished. If anything were to happen to me, my wife would be left very badly off. This insurance will put things right." "She didn't object to the idea?" inquired Evans casually. "Some ladies do, you know. Feel it's unlucky, that sort of thing." "Oh, Margaret is very practical," said Merrodane, smiling. "Not at all superstitious. In fact, I believe it was her idea originally. She didn't like my being so worried." Evans had got the information he wanted. He left the other shortly afterwards, and his lips were set in a grim line. The late Mr. Anthony had insured his life in his wife's favour a few weeks before his death. Accustomed to rely on his instincts, he was perfectly sure in his own mind. But how to act was another matter. He wanted not to arrest a criminal red-handed, but to prevent a crime being committed, and that was a very different and a very much more difficult thing. All day he was very thoughtful. There was a Primrose League fete that afternoon held in the grounds of the local squire, and he went to it, indulging in the penny dip, guessing the weight of a pig, and shying at coconuts, all with the same look of abstracted concentration on his face. He even indulged in half a crown's worth of Zara, the crystal gazer, smiling a little to himself as he did so, remembering his own activities against fortune-tellers in his official days. He did not pay very much heed to her sing-song droning voice, till the end of a sentence held his attention. "And you will very shortly indeed, be engaged on a matter of life or death to one person." What's that?" he asked abruptly. "A decision. You have a decision to make. You must be very careful, very, very careful. If you were to make a mistake, the smallest mistake." "Yes?" The fortune-teller shivered. Inspector Evans knew it was all nonsense, but he was nevertheless impressed. "I warn you, you must not make a mistake. If you do, I see the result clearly. A death." Odd. Damned odd. A death. Fancy her lighting upon that. "If I make a mistake, a death will result, is that it?" "Yes." "In that case," said Evans, rising to his feet and handing over half a crown, "I mustn't make a mistake, eh?" He spoke lightly enough, but as he went out of the tent, his jaw set determinedly. Easy to say, not so easy to be sure of doing. He mustn't make a slip. A life, a vulnerable human life depended on it, and there was no one to help him. He looked across at the figure of his friend Haydock in the distance. No help there. "Leave things alone," was Haydock's motto, and that wouldn't do here. Haydock was talking to a woman. She moved away from him and came towards Evans, and the inspector recognized her. It was Mrs. Merrodane. On an impulse, He put himself deliberately in her path. Mrs. Merrodine was rather a fine-looking woman. She had a broad, serene brow, very beautiful brown eyes, and a placid expression. She had the look of an Italian Madonna, which she heightened by parting her hair in the middle and looping it over her ears. She had a deep, rather sleepy voice. She smiled up at Evans, a contented, welcoming smile. "I thought it was you, Mrs. Anthony. I mean Mrs. Merrodine," he said glibly. He made the slip deliberately, watching her without seeming to do so. He saw her eyes widen, heard the quick intake of her breath. But her eyes did not falter. She gazed at him steadily and proudly. "I was looking for my husband," she said quietly. "Have you seen him anywhere about?" "He was over in that direction when I last saw him." They went side by side in the direction indicated, chatting quietly and pleasantly. The inspector felt his admiration mounting. What a woman! What self-command! What wonderful poise! A remarkable woman. And a very dangerous one. He felt sure, a very dangerous one. He still felt very uneasy, though he was satisfied with his initial step. He had let her know that he recognized her. That would put her on her guard. She would not dare attempt anything rash. There was the question of Merrodine, if he could be warned. They found the little man absently contemplating a china doll which had fallen to his share in the penny dip. His wife suggested going home, and he agreed eagerly. Mrs. Merrodine turned to the inspector. "Won't you come back with us and have a quiet cup of tea, Mr. Evans?" Was there a faint note of challenge in her voice? He thought there was. "Thank you, Mrs. Merrodine. I should like to very much." They walked there, talking together of pleasant ordinary things. The sun shone, a breeze blew gently, everything around them was pleasant and ordinary. Their maid was out at the fete, Mrs. Merrodine explained, when they arrived at the charming old-world cottage. She went into her room to remove her hat, returning to set out tea and boil the kettle on a little silver lamp. From a shelf near the fireplace she took 3 small bowls and saucers. "We have some very special Chinese tea," she explained, "and we always drink it in the Chinese manner, out of bowls, not cups." She broke off, peered into a bowl, and exchanged it for another with an exclamation of annoyance. "George, it's too bad of you. You've been taking these bowls again." "I'm sorry, dear," said the professor apologetically. "They're such a convenient size. The ones I ordered haven't come." "One of these days you'll poison us all," said his wife with a half-laugh. "Mary finds them in the laboratory and brings them back here, and never troubles to wash them out unless they've anything very noticeable in them. Why, you were using one of them for potassium cyanide the other day. Really, George, it's frightfully dangerous." Merrodine looked a little irritated. "Mary's no business to remove things from the laboratory. She's not to touch anything there." "But we often leave our teacups there after tea. How is she to know? Be reasonable, dear." The professor went into his laboratory, murmuring to himself, and with a smile Mrs. Merrodine poured boiling water on the tea and blew out the flame of the little silver lamp. Evans was puzzled, yet a glimmering of light penetrated to him. For some reason or other Mrs. Merrodine was showing her hand. Was this to be the accident? Was she speaking of all this so as deliberately to prepare her alibi beforehand? So that when, one day, the accident happened, he would be forced to give evidence in her favor. Stupid of her if so, because before that— Suddenly he drew in his breath. She had poured the tea into the 3 bowls. One she set before him, one before herself, the other she placed on a little table by the fire near the chair her husband usually sat in, and it was, as she placed this last one on the table, that a little strange smile curved round her lips. It was the smile that did it. He knew. A remarkable woman. A dangerous woman. No waiting, no preparation. This afternoon, this very afternoon, with him here as witness. The boldness of it took his breath away. It was clever. It was damnably clever. He would be able to prove nothing. She counted on his not suspecting, simply because it was so soon. A woman of lightning rapidity of thought and action. He drew a deep breath and leaned forward. "Mrs. Merrodine, I'm a man of queer whims. Will you be very kind and indulge me in one of them?" She looked inquiring but unsuspicious. He rose, took the bowl from in front of her, and crossed to the little table where he substituted it for the other. This other he brought back and placed in front of her. "I want to see you drink this." Her eyes met his. They were steady, unfathomable. The colour slowly drained from her face. She stretched out her hand, raised the cup. He held his breath, supposing all along he had made a mistake. She raised it to her lips. At the last moment, with a shudder, she leant forward and quickly poured it into a pot containing a fern. Then she sat back and gazed at him defiantly. He drew a long sigh of relief and sat down again. "Well," she said. Her voice had altered. It was slightly mocking, defiant. He answered her soberly and quietly. "You are a very clever woman, Mrs. Merrodine. I think you understand me. There must be no repetition. You know what I mean." "I know what you mean." Her voice was even, devoid of expression. He nodded his head, satisfied. She was a clever woman, and she didn't want to be hanged. "To your long life, and to that of your husband," he said significantly, and raised his tea to his lips. Then his face changed. It contorted horribly. He tried to rise, to cry out. His body stiffened. His face went purple. He fell back sprawling over his chair. His limbs convulsed. Mrs. Merrodine leaned forward, watching him. A little smile crossed her lips. She spoke to him, very softly and gently. "You made a mistake, Mr. Evans. You thought I wanted to kill George. How stupid of you, how very stupid." She sat there a minute longer, looking at the dead man, the third man who had threatened to cross her path and separate her from the man she loved. Her smile broadened. She looked more than ever like a Madonna. Then she raised her voice and called, "George, George, oh, do come here. I'm afraid there's been the most dreadful accident. Poor Mr. Evans." Agatha Christie, Philomel Cottage. Philomel Cottage was first published in Grand Magazine, November 1924. "Goodbye, darling." "Goodbye, sweetheart." Alex Martin stood leaning over the small rustic gate, watching the retreating figure of her husband as he walked down the road in the direction of the village. Presently he turned a bend and was lost to sight, but Alex still stayed in the same position, absent-mindedly smoothing a lock of the rich brown hair which had blown across her face, her eyes far away and dreamy. Alex Martin was not beautiful, nor even, strictly speaking, pretty. But her face, the face of a woman no longer in her first youth, was irradiated and softened until her former colleagues of the old office days would hardly have recognized her. Miss Alex King had been a trim, businesslike young woman, efficient, slightly brusque in manner, obviously capable and matter-of-fact. Alex had graduated in a hard school. For 15 years, from the age of 18 until she was 33, she had kept herself, and for 7 years of the time an invalid mother, by her work as a shorthand typist. It was the struggle for existence which had hardened the soft lines of her girlish face. True, there had been romance, of a kind, Dick Windyford, a fellow clerk. Very much of a woman at heart, Alex had always known without seeming to know that he cared. Outwardly they had been friends, nothing more. Out of his slender salary, Dick had been hard put to it to provide for the schooling of a younger brother. For the moment he could not think of marriage. And then suddenly, deliverance from daily toil had come to the girl in the most unexpected manner. A distant cousin had died, leaving her money to Alex, a few £1,000s, enough to bring in a couple of hundred a year. To Alex it was freedom, life, independence. Now she and Dick need wait no longer. But Dick reacted unexpectedly. He had never directly spoken of his love to Alex. Now he seemed less inclined to do so than ever. He avoided her, became morose and gloomy. Alex was quick to realize the truth. She had become a woman of means. Delicacy and pride stood in the way of Dick's asking her to be his wife. She liked him none the worse for it, and was indeed deliberating as to whether she herself might not take the first step, when for the second time the unexpected descended upon her. She met Gerald Martin at a friend's house. He fell violently in love with her, and within a week they were engaged. Alex, who had always considered herself not the falling-in-love kind, was swept clean off her feet. Unwittingly, she had found the way to arouse her former lover. Dick Windyford had come to her stammering with rage and anger. "The man's a perfect stranger to you. You know nothing about him." "I know that I love him." "How can you know?" "In a week." "It doesn't take everyone 11 years to find out that they're in love with a girl," cried Alex angrily. His face went white. "I've cared for you ever since I met you. I thought that you cared also." Alex was truthful. "I thought so too," she admitted. "But that was because I didn't know what love was." Then Dick had burst out again. Prayers, entreaties, even threats. Threats against the man who had supplanted him. It was amazing to Alex to see the volcano that existed beneath the reserved exterior of the man she had thought she knew so well. Her thoughts went back to that interview now, on this sunny morning, as she leant on the gate of the cottage. She had been married a month, and she was idyllically happy. Yet, in the momentary absence of the husband who was everything to her, a tinge of anxiety invaded her perfect happiness. And the cause of that anxiety was Dick Windyford. 3 times since her marriage she had dreamed the same dream. The environment differed, but the main facts were always the same. She saw her husband lying dead, and Dick Windyford standing over him, and she knew clearly and distinctly that his was the hand which had dealt the fatal blow. But horrible though that was, there was something more horrible still. Horrible that was on awakening, for in the dream it seemed perfectly natural and inevitable. She, Alex Martin, was glad that her husband was dead. She stretched out grateful hands to the murderer. Sometimes she thanked him. The dream always ended the same way, with herself clasped in Dick Windyford's arms. She had said nothing of this dream to her husband, but secretly it had perturbed her more than she liked to admit. Was it a warning? A warning against Dick Windyford? Alex was roused from her thoughts by the sharp ringing of the telephone bell from within the house. She entered the cottage and picked up the receiver. Suddenly she swayed and put out a hand against the wall. "Who did you say was speaking?" "Why, Alex, what's the matter with your voice? I wouldn't have known it. It's Dick." "Oh," said Alex. "Oh, where are you?" "At the Traveller's Arms. That's the right name, isn't it? Or don't you even know of the existence of your village pub? I'm on my holiday, doing a bit of fishing here. Any objection to my looking you 2 good people up this evening after dinner?" "No," said Alex sharply. "You mustn't come." There was a pause, and then Dick's voice, with a subtle alteration in it, spoke again. "I beg your pardon," he said formally. "Of course I won't bother you." Alex broke in hastily. He must think her behaviour too extraordinary. It was extraordinary. Her nerves must be all to pieces. "I only meant that we were engaged tonight," she explained, trying to make her voice sound as natural as possible. Won't you come to dinner tomorrow night?" But Dick evidently noticed the lack of cordiality in her tone. "Thanks very much," he said in the same formal voice. "But I may be moving on any time. Depends if a pal of mine turns up or not. Goodbye, Alex." He paused, and then added hastily in a different tone, "Best of luck to you, my dear." Alex hung up the receiver with a feeling of relief. "He mustn't come here," she repeated to herself. "He mustn't come here. Oh, what a fool I am! To imagine myself into a state like this. All the same, I'm glad he's not coming." She caught up a rustic rush hat from a table and passed out into the garden again, pausing to look up at the name carved over the porch. Philomel Cottage. "Isn't it a very fanciful name?" she had said to Gerald once before they were married. He had laughed. "You little cockney," he had said affectionately. "I don't believe you have ever heard a nightingale. I'm glad you haven't. Nightingales should sing only for lovers. We'll hear them together on a summer's evening outside our own home." And at the remembrance of how they had indeed heard them, Alex, standing in the doorway of her home, blushed happily. It was Gerald who had found Philomel Cottage. He had come to Alex bursting with excitement. He had found the very spot for them, unique, a gem, the chance of a lifetime. And when Alex had seen it, she too was captivated. It was true that the situation was rather lonely. They were 2 miles from the nearest village, but the cottage itself was so exquisite with its old-world appearance, and its solid comfort of bathrooms, hot water system, electric light and telephone, that she fell a victim to its charm immediately. And then a hitch occurred. The owner, a rich man who had made it his whim, declined to let it. He would only sell. Gerald Martin, though possessed of a good income, was unable to touch his capital. He could raise at most £1,000. The owner was asking 3, but Alex, who had set her heart on the place, came to the rescue. Her own capital was easily realized, being in bearer bonds. She would contribute half of it to the purchase of the home. So Philomel Cottage became their very own, and never for a minute had Alex regretted the choice. It was true that servants did not appreciate the rural solitude, indeed, at the moment they had none at all, but Alex, who had been starved of domestic life, thoroughly enjoyed cooking dainty little meals and looking after the house. The garden, which was magnificently stocked with flowers, was attended by an old man from the village who came twice a week. As she rounded the corner of the house, Alex was surprised to see the old gardener in question busy over the flower beds. She was surprised because his days for work were Mondays and Fridays, and today was Wednesday. "George, what are you doing here?" she asked as she came towards him. The old man straightened up with a chuckle, touching the brim of an aged cap. "I thought as how you'd be surprised, ma'am, but 'tis this way. There be a fete over to Squire's on Friday, and I says to myself, neither Mr. Martin nor yet his good lady won't take it amiss if I comes for once on a Wednesday instead of a Friday." "That's quite all right," said Alex. "I hope you'll enjoy yourself at the fete." "I reckon too," said George simply. "It's a fine thing to be able to eat your fill and know all the time as it's not you as is paying for it. Squire Alice has a proper sit-down tea for his tenants. Then I thought too, ma'am, as I might as well see you before you goes away so as to learn your wishes for the boarders. You have no idea when you'll be back, ma'am, I suppose?" "But I'm not going away." George stared. "Ain't you going to London tomorrow?" "No." "What put such an idea into your head?" George jerked his head over his shoulder. "Met Maester down to village yesterday. He told me you was both going away to London tomorrow, and it was uncertain when you'd be back again." "Nonsense," said Alex, laughing. "You must have misunderstood him." All the same, she wondered exactly what it could have been that Gerald had said to lead the old man into such a curious mistake. Going to London? She never wanted to go to London again. "I hate London," she said suddenly and harshly. "Ah," said George placidly. "I must have been mistook somehow, and yet he said it plain enough, it seemed to me. I'm glad you're stopping on here. I don't hold with all this gallivanting about, and I don't think nothing of London. I've never needed to go there. Too many moty cars. That's the trouble nowadays. Once people have got a moty car, blessed if they can stay still anywheres. Mr. Ames, what used to have this house? Nice, peaceful sort of gentleman he was until he bought one of them things. Hadn't had it a month before he put up this cottage for sale. A tidy lot he'd spent on it too, with taps in all the bedrooms and the electric light and all. 'You'll never see your money back,' I says to him. 'But,' he says to me, 'I'll get every penny of £2,000 for this house.' And sure enough, he did." "He got 3,000, said Alex, smiling. 2,000, repeated George. The sum he was asking was talked of at the time. "It really was 3,000, said Alex. "Ladies never understand figures," said George, unconvinced. "You'll not tell me that Mr. Ames had the face to stand up to you and say 3,000 brazen-like in a loud voice?" "He didn't say it to me," said Alex. "He said it to my husband." George stooped again to his flower bed. "The price was 2,000, he said obstinately. Alex did not trouble to argue with him. Moving to one of the farther beds, she began to pick an armful of flowers. As she moved with her fragrant posy towards the house, Alex noticed a small dark green object peeping from between some leaves in one of the beds. She stooped and picked it up, recognizing it for her husband's pocket diary. She opened it, scanning the entries with some amusement. Almost from the beginning of their married life, she had realized that the impulsive and emotional Gerald had the uncharacteristic virtues of neatness and method. He was extremely fussy about meals being punctual, and always planned his day ahead with the accuracy of a timetable. Looking through the diary, she was amused to notice the entry on the date of May 14th. Marry, Alex St. Peter's 2:30. "The big silly," murmured Alex to herself, turning the pages. Suddenly she stopped. "Wednesday, June 18th. Why, that's today." In the space for that day was written in Gerald's neat, precise hand, 9 p.m. Nothing else. What had Gerald planned to do at 9 p.m., Alex wondered. She smiled to herself as she realized that, had this been a story, like those she had so often read, the diary would doubtless have furnished her with some sensational revelation. It would have had in it for certain the name of another woman. She fluttered the back pages idly. There were dates, appointments, cryptic references to business deals, but only one woman's name, her own. Yet, as she slipped the book into her pocket and went on with her flowers to the house, she was aware of a vague uneasiness. Those words of Dick Windyford's recurred to her almost as though he had been at her elbow repeating them. "The man's a perfect stranger to you. You know nothing about him." It was true. What did she know about him? After all, Gerald was 40. In 40 years there must have been women in his life. Alex shook herself impatiently. She must not give way to these thoughts. She had a far more instant preoccupation to deal with. Should she, or should she not, tell her husband that Dick Windyford had rung her up? There was the possibility to be considered that Gerald might have already run across him in the village. But in that case he would be sure to mention it to her immediately upon his return, and matters would be taken out of her hands. Otherwise— What? Alex was aware of a distinct desire to say nothing about it. If she told him, he was sure to suggest asking Dick Windyford to Philomel Cottage. Then she would have to explain that Dick had proposed himself, and that she had made an excuse to prevent his coming. And when he asked her why she had done so, what could she say? Tell him her dream? But he would only laugh, or worse, see that she attached an importance to it which he did not. In the end, rather shamefacedly, Alex decided to say nothing. It was the first secret she had ever kept from her husband, and the consciousness of it made her feel ill at ease. When she heard Gerald returning from the village shortly before lunch, she hurried into the kitchen and pretended to be busy with the cooking, so as to hide her confusion. It was evident at once that Gerald had seen nothing of Dick Windyford. Alex felt at once relieved and embarrassed. She was definitely committed now to a policy of concealment. It was not until after their simple evening meal, when they were sitting in the oak-benched living room with the windows thrown open to let in the sweet night air, scented with the perfume of the mauve and white stocks outside, that Alex remembered the pocket diary. "Here's something you've been watering the flowers with," she said, and threw it into his lap. "Dropped it in the border, did I?" "Yes. I know all your secrets now." "Not guilty," said Gerald, shaking his head. "What about your assignation at 9 o'clock tonight?" "Oh, that—" He seemed taken aback for a moment. Then he smiled as though something afforded him particular amusement. "It's an assignation with a particularly nice girl, Alex. She's got brown hair and blue eyes, and she's very like you." "I don't understand," said Alex with mock severity. "You're evading the point." "No, I'm not. As a matter of fact, that's a reminder that I'm going to develop some negatives tonight, and I want you to help me." Gerald Martin was an enthusiastic photographer. He had a somewhat old-fashioned camera, but with an excellent lens, and he developed his own plates in a small cellar, which he had fitted up as a darkroom. "And it must be done at 9 o'clock precisely," said Alex teasingly. Gerald looked a little vexed. "My dear girl," he said, with a shade of testiness in his manner, One should always plan a thing for a definite time. Then one gets through one's work properly. Alex sat for a minute or two in silence, watching her husband as he lay in his chair smoking, his dark head flung back and the clear-cut lines of his clean-shaven face showing up against the somber background. And suddenly, from some unknown source, a wave of panic surged over her, so that she cried out before she could stop herself. "Oh, Gerald, I wish I knew more about you." Her husband turned an astonished face upon her. "But my dear Alex, you do know all about me. I've told you of my boyhood in Northumberland, of my life in South Africa, and these last 10 years in Canada which have brought me success." "Oh, business," said Alex scornfully. Gerald laughed suddenly. "I know what you mean. Love affairs. You women are all the same. Nothing interests you but the personal element." Alex felt her throat go dry as she muttered indistinctly. "Well, but there must have been love affairs. I mean, if I only knew—" There was silence again for a minute or two. Gerald Martin was frowning, a look of indecision on his face. When he spoke, it was gravely, without a trace of his former bantering manner. "Do you think it wise, Alex, this Bluebeard's chamber business? There have been women in my life. Yes, I don't deny it. You wouldn't believe me if I denied it. But I can swear to you truthfully that not one of them meant anything to me." There was a ring of sincerity in his voice which comforted the listening wife. "Satisfied, Alex?" he asked with a smile. Then he looked at her with a shade of curiosity. "What has turned your mind on to these unpleasant subjects, tonight of all nights?" Alex got up and began to walk about restlessly. "Oh, I don't know," she said. "I've been nervy all day." "That's odd," said Gerald, in a low voice, as though speaking to himself. "That's very odd." "Why is it odd?" "Oh, my dear girl, don't flash out at me so. I only said it was odd because, as a rule, you're so sweet and serene." Alex forced a smile. "Everything's conspired to annoy me today," she confessed. "Even old George had got some ridiculous idea into his head that we were going away to London. He said you had told him so." "Where did you see him?" asked Gerald sharply. "He came to work today instead of Friday." "Damned old fool," said Gerald angrily. Alex stared in surprise. Her husband's face was convulsed with rage. She had never seen him so angry. Seeing her astonishment, Gerald made an effort to regain control of himself. "Well, he is a damned old fool," he protested. "What can you have said to make him think that?" I never said anything. At least, oh yes, I remember. I made some weak joke about being off to London in the morning, and I suppose he took it seriously. Or else he didn't hear properly. You undeceived him, of course?" He waited anxiously for her reply. "Of course. But he's the sort of old man who, if once he gets an idea in his head, well, it isn't so easy to get it out again." Then she told him of George's insistence on the sum asked for the cottage. Gerald was silent for a minute or two. Then he said slowly, "Ames was willing to take 2,000 in cash and the remaining 1,000 on mortgage. That's the origin of that mistake, I fancy." "Very likely," agreed Alex. Then she looked up at the clock and pointed to it with a mischievous finger. "We ought to be getting down to it, Gerald. 5 minutes behind schedule." A very peculiar smile came over Gerald Martin's face. "I've changed my mind," he said quietly. "I shan't do any photography tonight." A woman's mind is a curious thing. When she went to bed that Wednesday night, Alex's mind was contented and at rest. Her momentarily assailed happiness reasserted itself, triumphant as of yore. But by the evening of the following day, she realized that some subtle forces were at work undermining it. Dick Windyford had not rung up again. Nevertheless, she felt what she supposed to be his influence at work. Again and again those words of his recurred to her. "The man's a perfect stranger. You know nothing about him." And with them came the memory of her husband's face, photographed clearly on her brain, as he said, "Do you think it wise, Alex, this Bluebeard's chamber business?" Why had he said that? There had been warning in them, a hint of menace. It was as though he had said, in effect, "You had better not pry into my life, Alex. You may get a nasty shock if you do." By Friday morning, Alex had convinced herself that there had been a woman in Gerald's life, a Bluebeard's chamber, that he had sedulously sought to conceal from her. Her jealousy, slow to awaken, was now rampant. Was it a woman he had been going to meet that night at 9 p.m.? Was his story of photographs to develop a lie invented upon the spur of the moment? 3 days ago, she would have sworn that she knew her husband through and through. Now it seemed to her that he was a stranger of whom she knew nothing. She remembered his unreasonable anger against old George, so at variance with his usual good-tempered manner. A small thing, perhaps, but it showed her that she did not really know the man who was her husband. There were several little things required on Friday from the village. In the afternoon, Alex suggested that she should go for them whilst Gerald remained in the garden. But somewhat to her surprise, he opposed this plan vehemently, and insisted on going himself whilst she remained at home. Alex was forced to give way to him, but his insistence surprised and alarmed her. Why was he so anxious to prevent her going to the village? Suddenly, an explanation suggested itself to her, which made the whole thing clear. Was it not possible that, whilst saying nothing to her, Gerald had indeed come across Dick Windyford? Her own jealousy, entirely dormant at the time of their marriage, had only developed afterwards. Might it not be the same with Gerald? Might he not be anxious to prevent her seeing Dick Windyford again? This explanation was so consistent with the facts, and so comforting to Alex's perturbed mind, that she embraced it eagerly. Yet, when tea-time had come and passed, she was restless and ill at ease. She was struggling with a temptation that had assailed her ever since Gerald's departure. Finally, pacifying her conscience with the assurance that the room did need a thorough tidying, she went upstairs to her husband's dressing-room. She took a duster with her to keep up the pretence of housewifery. "If I were only sure," she repeated to herself. "If I could only be sure." In vain she told herself that anything compromising would have been destroyed ages ago. Against that she argued that men do sometimes keep the most damning piece of evidence through an exaggerated sentimentality. In the end, Alex succumbed. Her cheeks burning with the shame of her action, she hunted breathlessly through packets of letters and documents, turned out the drawers, even went through the pockets of her husband's clothes. Only 2 drawers eluded her. The lower drawer of the chest of drawers and the small right-hand drawer of the writing desk were both locked. But Alex was by now lost to all shame. In one of these drawers, she was convinced that she would find evidence of this imaginary woman of the past who obsessed her. She remembered that Gerald had left his keys lying carelessly on the sideboard downstairs. She fetched them and tried them one by one. The 3rd key fitted the writing-table drawer. Alex pulled it open eagerly. There was a cheque-book and a wallet well stuffed with notes, and at the back of the drawer a packet of letters tied up with a piece of tape. Her breath coming unevenly, Alex untied the tape. Then a deep, burning blush overspread her face, and she dropped the letters back into the drawer, closing and relocking it. For the letters were her own, written to Gerald Martin before she married him. She turned now to the chest of drawers, more with a wish to feel that she had left nothing undone than from any expectation of finding what she sought. To her annoyance, none of the keys on Gerald's bunch fitted the drawer in question. Not to be defeated, Alex went into the other rooms and brought back a selection of keys with her. To her satisfaction, the key of the spare-room wardrobe also fitted the chest of drawers. She unlocked the drawer and pulled it open, but there was nothing in it but a roll of newspaper clippings already dirty and discoloured with age. Alex breathed a sigh of relief. Nevertheless, she glanced at the clippings, curious to know what subject had interested Gerald so much that he had taken the trouble to keep the dusty roll. They were nearly all American papers, dated some 7 years ago, and dealing with the trial of the notorious swindler and bigamist Charles Lemaitre. Lemaitre had been suspected of doing away with his women victims. A skeleton had been found beneath the floor of one of the houses he had rented, and most of the women he had married had never been heard of again. He had defended himself from the charges with consummate skill, aided by some of the best legal talent in the United States. The Scottish verdict of "not proven" might perhaps have stated the case best. In its absence, He was found not guilty on the capital charge, though sentenced to a long term of imprisonment on the other charges preferred against him. Alex remembered the excitement caused by the case at the time, and also the sensation aroused by the escape of Lemaitre some 3 years later. He had never been recaptured. The personality of the man and his extraordinary power over women had been discussed at great length in the English papers at the time, together with an account of his excitability in court, his passionate protestations, and his occasional sudden physical collapses due to the fact that he had a weak heart, though the ignorant accredited it to his dramatic powers. There was a picture of him in one of the clippings Alex held, and she studied it with some interest, a long-bearded, scholarly-looking gentleman. Who was it the face reminded her of? Suddenly, with a shock, she realized that it was Gerald himself. The eyes and brow bore a strong resemblance to his. Perhaps he had kept the cutting for that reason. Her eyes went on to the paragraph beside the picture. Certain dates, it seemed, had been entered in the accused's pocketbook, and it was contended that these were dates when he had done away with his victims. Then a woman gave evidence and identified the prisoner positively by the fact that he had a mole on his left wrist, just below the palm of the hand. Alex dropped the papers and swayed as she stood. On his left wrist, just below the palm, her husband had a small scar. The room whirled round her. Afterwards, it struck her as strange that she should have leaped at once to such absolute certainty. Gerald Martin was Charles Lemaitre. She knew it, and accepted it in a flash. Disjointed fragments whirled through her brain like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fitting into place. The money paid for the house, her money only. The bearer bonds she had entrusted to his keeping. Even her dream appeared in its true significance. Deep down in her, her subconscious self had always feared Gerald Martin and wished to escape from him, and it was to Dick Windyford this self of hers had looked for help. That, too, was why she was able to accept the truth too easily, without doubt or hesitation. She was to have been another of Lemaitre's victims. Very soon, perhaps. A half-cry escaped her as she remembered something. Wednesday, 9 p.m. The cellar, with the flagstones that were so easily raised. Once before he had buried one of his victims in a cellar. It had been all planned for Wednesday night. But to write it down beforehand in that methodical manner, insanity. No, it was logical. Gerald always made a memorandum of his engagements. Murder was to him a business proposition like any other. But what had saved her? What could possibly have saved her? Had he relented at the last minute? No. In a flash the answer came to her. Old George. She understood now her husband's uncontrollable anger. Doubtless he had paved the way by telling everyone he met that they were going to London the next day. Then George had come to work unexpectedly, had mentioned London to her, and she had contradicted the story. Too risky to do away with her that night, with old George repeating that conversation. But what an escape! If she had not happened to mention that trivial matter— Alex shuddered. And then she stayed motionless as though frozen to stone. She had heard the creak of the gate into the road. Her husband had returned. For a moment, Alex stayed as though petrified. Then she crept on tiptoe to the window, looking out from behind the shelter of the curtain. Yes, it was her husband. He was smiling to himself and humming a little tune. In his hand he held an object which almost made the terrified girl's heart stop beating. It was a brand-new spade. Alex leaped to a knowledge born of instinct. It was to be tonight. But there was still a chance. Gerald, humming his little tune, went round to the back of the house. Without hesitating a moment, she ran down the stairs and out of the cottage. But just as she emerged from the door, her husband came round the other side of the house. "Hello," he said. "Where are you running off to in such a hurry?" Alex strove desperately to appear calm and as usual. Her chance was gone for the moment, but if she was careful not to arouse his suspicions, it would come again later. Even now, perhaps. "I was going to walk to the end of the lane and back," she said, in a voice that sounded weak and uncertain in her own ears. "Right. said Gerald. "I'll come with you." "No, please, Gerald, I'm nervy, headachy. I'd rather go alone." He looked at her attentively. She fancied a momentary suspicion gleamed in his eye. "What's the matter with you, Alex? You're pale, trembling." "Nothing." She forced herself to be brusque, smiling. "I've got a headache, that's all. A walk will do me good." "Well, it's no good your saying you don't want me," declared Gerald with his easy laugh. "I'm coming, whether you want me or not." She dared not protest further, if he suspected that she knew. With an effort she managed to regain something of her normal manner, yet she had an uneasy feeling that he looked at her sideways every now and then, as though not quite satisfied. She felt that his suspicions were not completely allayed. When they returned to the house, he insisted on her lying down, and brought some eau de cologne to bathe her temples. He was, as ever, the devoted husband. Alex felt herself as helpless as though bound hand and foot in a trap. Not for a minute would he leave her alone. He went with her into the kitchen and helped her to bring in the simple cold dishes she had already prepared. Supper was a meal that choked her, yet she forced herself to eat, and even to appear gay and natural. She knew now that she was fighting for her life. She was alone with this man, miles from help, absolutely at his mercy. Her only chance was so to lull his suspicions that he would leave her alone for a few moments, long enough for her to get to the telephone in the hall and summon assistance. That was her only hope now. A momentary hope flashed over her as she remembered how he had abandoned his plan before. Suppose she told him that Dick Windyford was coming up to see them that evening? The words trembled on her lips, then she rejected them hastily. This man would not be balked a second time. There was a determination, an elation underneath his calm bearing that sickened her. She would only precipitate the crime. He would murder her there and then, and calmly ring up Dick Windyford with a tale of having been suddenly called away. Oh, if only Dick Windyford were coming to the house this evening. If Dick... A sudden idea flashed into her mind. She looked sharply sideways at her husband, as though she feared that he might read her mind. With the forming of a plan, her courage was reinforced. She became so completely natural in manner that she marvelled at herself. She made the coffee and took it out to the porch where they often sat on fine evenings. "By the way," said Gerald suddenly, "we'll do those photographs later." Alex felt a shiver run through her, but she replied nonchalantly, "Can't you manage alone? I'm rather tired tonight." "It won't take long," he smiled to himself, "and I can promise you won't be tired afterwards." The words seemed to amuse him. Alex shuddered. Now or never was the time to carry out her plan. She rose to her feet. "I'm just going to telephone to the butcher," she announced nonchalantly. "Don't you bother to move." "To the butcher? At this time of night?" "His shop's shut, of course, silly. But he's in his house all right. And tomorrow's Saturday, and I want him to bring me some veal cutlets early, before someone else grabs them off him. The old dear will do anything for me." She passed quickly into the house, closing the door behind her. She heard Gerald say, "Don't shut the door," and was quick with her light reply, "It keeps the moths out." "I hate moths. Are you afraid I'm going to make love to the butcher, silly?" Once inside, she snatched down the telephone receiver and gave the number of the Traveller's Arms. She was put through at once. "Mr. Windyford? Is he still there? Can I speak to him?" Then her heart gave a sickening thump. The door was pushed open, and her husband came into the hall. "Do go away, Gerald," she said pettishly. "I hate anyone listening when I'm telephoning." He merely laughed and threw himself into a chair. "Sure it really is the butcher you're telephoning to?" he quizzed. Alex was in despair. Her plan had failed. In a minute, Dick Windyford would come to the phone. Should she risk all and cry out an appeal for help? And then, as she nervously depressed and released the little key in the receiver she was holding, which permits the voice to be heard or not heard at the other end, another plan flashed into her head. "It will be difficult," she thought to herself. "It means keeping my head and thinking of the right words. and not faltering for a moment. But I believe I could do it. I must do it. And at that minute, she heard Dick Windyford's voice at the other end of the phone. Alex drew a deep breath. Then she depressed the key firmly and spoke. "Mrs. Martin speaking, from Philomel Cottage. Please come," she released the key, "tomorrow morning with 6 nice veal cutlets." She depressed the key again. "It's very important." She released the key. "Thank you so much, Mr. Hexworthy. You won't mind my ringing you up so late?" "I hope, but those veal cutlets are really a matter of—" She depressed the key again. "Life or death." She released it. "Very well. Tomorrow morning," she depressed it, "as soon as possible." And she replaced the receiver on the hook and turned to face her husband, breathing hard. "So that's how you talk to your butcher, is it?" said Gerald. "It's the feminine touch," said Alex lightly. She was simmering with excitement. He had suspected nothing. Dick, even if he didn't understand, would come. She passed into the sitting room and switched on the electric light. Gerald followed her. "You seem very full of spirits now," he said, watching her curiously. "Yes," said Alex. "My headache's gone." She sat down in her usual seat and smiled at her husband as he sank into his own chair opposite her. She was saved. It was only 8:20. Long before 9 o'clock, Dick would have arrived. "I didn't think much of that coffee you gave me," complained Gerald. "It tasted very bitter." "It's a new kind I was trying. We won't have it again if you don't like it, dear." Alex took up a piece of needlework and began to stitch. Gerald read a few pages of his book. Then he glanced up at the clock and tossed the book away. 8:30. Time to go down to the cellar and start work. The sewing slipped from Alex's fingers. "Oh, not yet. Let us wait until 9 o'clock. No, my girl, 8:30. That's the time I fixed. You'll be able to get to bed all the earlier." "But I'd rather wait until 9. "You know when I fix a time, I always stick to it. Come along, Alex. I'm not going to wait a minute longer." Alex looked up at him, and in spite of herself, she felt a wave of terror slide over her. The mask had been lifted. Gerald's hands were twitching, his eyes were shining with excitement. He was continually passing his tongue over his dry lips. He no longer cared to conceal his excitement. Alex thought, "It's true. He can't wait. He's like a madman." He strode over to her and jerked her onto her feet with a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, my girl, or I'll carry you there." His tone was gay, but there was an undisguised ferocity behind it that appalled her. With a supreme effort, she jerked herself free and clung cowering against the wall. She was powerless. She couldn't get away, she couldn't do anything, and he was coming towards her. "Now, Alex!" "No, no!" she screamed, her hands held out impotently to ward him off. "Gerald, stop. I've got something to tell you, something to confess." He did stop. "To confess?" he said curiously. "Yes, to confess." She had used the words at random, but she went on desperately, seeking to hold his arrested attention. A look of contempt swept over his face. "A former lover, I suppose?" he sneered. "No," said Alex. "Something else. You'd call it, I expect. Yes, you'd call it a crime." And at once she saw that she had struck the right note. Again his attention was arrested, held. Seeing that, her nerve came back to her. She felt mistress of the situation once more. "You had better sit down again," she said quietly. She herself crossed the room to her old chair and sat down. She even stooped and picked up her needlework. But behind her calmness, she was thinking and inventing feverishly. For the story she invented must hold his interest until help arrived. "I told you," she said slowly, "that I had been a shorthand typist for 15 years. That was not entirely true. There were 2 intervals. The first occurred when I was 22. I came across a man, an elderly man with a little property. He fell in love with me and asked me to marry him. I accepted. We were married." She paused. "I induced him to insure his life in my favor." She saw a sudden keen interest spring up in her husband's face, and went on with renewed assurance. "During the war, I worked for a time in a hospital dispensary. There I had the handling of all kinds of rare drugs and poisons." She paused reflectively. He was keenly interested now, not a doubt of it. The murderer is bound to have an interest in murder. She had gambled on that, and succeeded. She stole a glance at the clock. It was 20 to 9. "There is one poison. It is a little white powder. A pinch of it means death. You know something about poisons, perhaps?" She put the question in some trepidation. If he did, she would have to be careful. "No," said Gerald. "I know very little about them." She drew a breath of relief. "You have heard of hyoscine, of course. This is a drug that acts much the same way, but is absolutely untraceable. Any doctor would give a certificate of heart failure. I stole a small quantity of this drug and kept it by me." She paused, marshalling her forces. "Go on," said Gerald. "No, I'm afraid. I can't tell you. Another time." "Now," he said impatiently, "I want to hear." "We had been married a month. I was very good to my elderly husband, very kind and devoted. He spoke in praise of me to all the neighbours. Everyone knew what a devoted wife I was. I always made his coffee myself every evening. One evening, when we were alone together, I put a pinch of the deadly alkaloid in his cup." Alex paused and carefully rethreaded her needle. She, who had never acted in her life, rivaled the greatest actress in the world at this moment. She was actually living the part of the cold-blooded poisoner. It was very peaceful. I sat watching him. Once he gasped a little and asked for air. I opened the window. Then he said he could not move from his chair. Presently he died." She stopped, smiling. It was 9:15. Surely they would come soon. "How much," said Gerald, "was the insurance money?" "About £2,000. I speculated with it and lost it. I went back to my office work, but I never meant to remain there long. Then I met another man. I had stuck to my maiden name at the office. He didn't know I had been married before. He was a younger man, rather good-looking and quite well off. We were married quietly in Sussex. He didn't want to insure his life, but of course he made a will in my favour. He liked me to make his coffee myself, just as my first husband had done." Alex smiled reflectively and added simply, "I make very good coffee." Then she went on, "I had several friends in the village where we were living. They were very sorry for me, with my husband dying suddenly of heart failure one evening after dinner. I didn't quite like the doctor. I don't think he suspected me, but he was certainly very surprised at my husband's sudden death. I don't quite know why I drifted back to the office again. Habit, I suppose. My second husband left about £4,000. I didn't speculate with it this time. I invested it. Then, you see—" But she was interrupted. Gerald Martin, his face suffused with blood, half choking, was pointing a shaking forefinger at her. "The coffee! My God! The coffee!" She stared at him. "I understand now why it was bitter. You devil! You've been up to your tricks again." His hands gripped the arms of his chair. He was ready to spring upon her. "You've poisoned me!" Alex had retreated from him to the fireplace. Now, terrified, she opened her lips to deny, and then paused. In another minute he would spring upon her. She summoned all her strength. Her eyes held his steadily, compellingly. "Yes," she said, "I poisoned you. Already the poison is working. At the minute you can't move from your chair, you can't move. If she could keep him there, even a few minutes." Ah, what was that? Footsteps on the road, the creak of the gate, then footsteps on the path outside, the outer door opening. "You can't move," she said again. Then she slipped past him and fled headlong from the room to fall fainting into Dick Windyford's arms. "My God! Alex!" he cried. Then he turned to the man with him, a tall, stalwart figure in policeman's uniform. "Go and see what's been happening in that room." He laid Alex carefully down on a couch and bent over her. "My little girl," he murmured. "My poor little girl. What have they been doing to you?" Her eyelids fluttered, and her lips just murmured his name. And Dick was aroused by the policeman's touching him on the arm. "There's nothing in that room, sir, but a man sitting in a chair. Looks as though he'd had some kind of bad fright, and—" "Yes?" "Well, sir, he's dead." They were startled by hearing Alex's voice. She spoke as though in some kind of dream, her eyes still closed. "And presently," she said, almost as though she were quoting from something, "he died." Thank you very much for listening to this story, narrated by Jason Fraser.